We're going to talk about the process of incorporation a lot today, which means how protection from the first 10 amendments was extended to the states. Originally, the Bill of Rights only applied to the federal government, as established in the case of Baltimore v. Barron back in 1833. The quick version here is that John Barron, a great name by the way, owned a wharf in the harbor of Baltimore. As the city developed and expanded, large amounts of sand accumulated in the harbor, depriving Barron of the deep waters which had been the key to his successful business. He sued the city to recover his losses under the Fifth Amendment, arguing that the state government had taken away his property without just compensation. Barron ultimately loses the case because the Supreme Court asserts that the Fifth Amendment only applied to the federal government and not the states. Think about this for a minute. The states could take away your rights freely, but the federal government couldn't. Do we really have any rights if this is the case? And it shows, I guess, the incredible faith that they put in state governments back in earlier times. We still see a legacy of that in some places today. The incorporation process really began to happen through the 14th Amendment. The idea that all citizens are guaranteed due process and equal protection under the law, and that rights of citizenship weren't subject to state controls, gave the Supreme Court a way to decide that civil rights protections extended to the states as well as the federal government. So this is 100 years into our history, we finally started to incorporate the amendments to the states as well as the federal government. However, even this took some time because in the slaughterhouse cases, the Supreme Court decided that the 14th Amendment only applied to African Americans, although as we talked about last time, this was later overturned. Even then, it doesn't happen all at once. We had what is called selective incorporation, which means that each amendment had to be applied to the states separately. We have the Fifth Amendment being incorporated in 1897, First Amendment freedoms, speech, press, and religion, all the way in the 1930s and 40s, the Fourth, Fifth, and Sixth Amendments with due process covered in the 1960s, 1970s, and then the Second Amendment finally being incorporated only a couple of years ago. Now we have the contemporary focus on the rights of privacy and how that relates to the Constitution. The next part of the lecture is going to go through most of these rights, how they were incorporated, and what that means. One of the interesting things to note is the evolution of some of these rights over time, and how these rights haven't always been as absolute as we think of them now. The first right we're going to talk about is one in the very first amendment of the Bill of Rights, freedom of speech. In the early years of the 20th century, the court rejected arguments for nationalizing free speech guarantees through the 14th Amendment, leaving these guarantees to the state governments instead. They did seek to define the degree to which federal legislation must protect free speech, especially during a time when we were afraid of communism and revolution. The first case I wanted to discuss was Schenck versus United States in 1919. During World War I, Schenck made circulars to draftees. These circulars suggested that the draft was a monstrous wrong motivated by the capitalist system. The circulars urged, do not submit to intimidation, but advised only peaceful action, such as petitioning to repeal the Conscription Act. Schenck was charged with conspiracy to violate the Espionage Act by attempting to cause insubordination in the military and to obstruct recruitment. Was Schenck's speech protected by the First Amendment? Well, according to the courts at the time, the answer was no, because the Supreme Court asserted that his speech constituted a clear and present danger to the United States. The war was going on, and the United States needed to draft people into service and prevent the world from falling under control of various evildoers. To tell people to resist this draft was to risk throwing the world into chaos. The Supreme Court argued that dangerous speech could be curtailed and was not subject to First Amendment protections as of this case.